Hello everybody and welcome. So this video, if I can get my equipment working correctly, is all about taking a look at division by zero. And can you hear me? Okay. So let's jump right in. Here's the question. Why can't we divide by zero? That is the question. And then there's another question, and that is, what does division by zero look like? So two questions there. Let's start with the first one. Why can't we divide by zero? And in one sentence, the answer is because it changes your previously true statement into garbage. And once again, I started at the bottom and I meant to start at the top. Oops. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go up. Why can't we divide by zero? I'll leave that in the frame. So stay with me. I want to make an argument. Suppose A and B are the same. So we got two numbers and they're equal to each other. Okay, I'm going to do some mathematics. And before I really get in there and start doing math, let's keep this in mind, right? A divided by A, any number divided by itself is 1. And also any number minus itself, if I subtract a number from itself, 5 minus 5, 3 minus 3, that's going to be 0. Okay? So with these ideas in mind, let's subtract B from both sides. And if I do that, I'm using this property here. B minus B is going to be 0. And over here, it's A minus B. A is already over here. A minus B equals 0. And that makes sense. If A and B are the same, then if you subtract the two, you're going to definitely get 0. Okay, now, what I can do is, I got this number A minus B. I can divide both sides by A minus B. And let's take a look at what happens if we do that. On the left-hand side, A minus B over itself, well, that's just this property here. Okay? A minus B over A minus B, that's 1. And over here, 0 over anything, right? So if you, if you've ever gotten a test or a quiz or an assignment, you did really, really bad on it, you got a 0 on it, 0 out of 10, for example. 0 out of 10 is 0, right? 0 over any number is 0. So we wind up at this place where we have 1 equals 0. And, what? How can this even be the case, right? I mean, we started out by saying A and B are the same. And by doing mathematical things, we wind up here. And the reason that we started with two numbers being identical and then ended with complete nonsense, this is complete nonsense. 1 equals 0. What are you talking about? Okay? The way that we got here was here. We attempted to divide by A minus B. And A minus B equals 0. So here we attempted to divide by 0. And by trying to do this, that is what led us to this very, very illogical statement. So, this is sort of the why we can't divide by 0, because it takes something that was perfectly fine and true and completely changes it into absolute nonsensical, illogical garbage. So there's the y. What does division by 0 look like? Okay, well, to answer this question, let's just consider a simple function. And the name of this function is the reciprocal function, 1 over x. Okay? Now, first, let's make a little table, right? Let's make a little table. And I want to leave a little bit of room here. Okay, so I have a range of x values here. Just so we can understand what's going on. Okay, so if I plug these x values into this function, you know, x is negative 1,000,000, so 1 over 1,000,000 is negative. We get negative 1 over 1,000,000. Which is like negative 0. This is, you know, it's 1,000,000th, right? So we get tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths, 100,000ths, and then 1,000,000th, right? So the first thing I want to point out here is that if you divide by a large number, 1 over a large number is very, very small. That's the first thing. It's so important, I'm going to say it again. 1 over a very large number is a very small number. Okay, all right. Now here, negative 1,000. This number is substantially smaller than negative 1,000,000, so we should expect a substantially bigger result. Negative 1 over 1,000 if we plug it in, and that is negative 0.001. That is negative 1 in 1,000. Okay. So yeah, there's way less zeros. So this number is much bigger than this one. Let's keep going. You get to, hopefully you get to see the pattern. Negative 1/3. Okay. Negative 1/2. Negative 1. These numbers are getting bigger. These numbers are getting bigger. Okay, now what about this, right? What if we take 1 and divide it by 0.01 with a negative sign? Well, what we can do is we can multiply this fraction by 1. In other words, we can multiply top and bottom by 10. On the top, 1 times 10 is 10. On the bottom, with a negative sign. On the bottom, if I take 0.01 and multiply by 10, I just got to move the decimal place over 1. So I get 0.1 here. And I can multiply by 10 again. 10 times 10 is 100 with a negative sign. Over 1. There we go. So this number is negative 100. So look at what happened. Look at what happened. I divided by a tiny number, and I got back a huge number. In other words, 0.01 is way, way, way smaller than 100. If I divide by 0.001, or 0.01 rather, then I'm going to get a large number in return. So let me write this down. This idea about dividing by large numbers or small numbers is extremely important for just understanding how numbers work. Yeah. So 1 over a huge number is going to give me a tiny number in return. Likewise, 1 over a tiny number, as we have witnessed, 1 over a tiny number is going to give me a huge number back. Okay? So keep that in mind just as you sort of move forward in life, because just understanding how this little stuff works really helps your number sense. And number sense is a good thing to have in modern times. Anyway, let's keep going, right? So this is what happened if I divided by 0.01 with a negative sign. And here I have thrown 1, 2, with 4 zeros, right? So, let's take a look at that, right? Negative 1 over 0 point, and then 4 zeros. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay. So, we can multiply by 10 a whole bunch of times. How many times? Multiply by 10, 100, multiply by 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, right? So this is the same thing as negative 100,000. And that's not 100,000. Let me get rid of that. Sorry. Negative 100,000 is what we're going to get there. And okay, here's 0, right? And as we've just witnessed, if you divide by 0, you get nonsense. So this is actually undefined here. Here we get 100,000. Here we get, negative 100. Okay, and now positive. How many zeros do we get here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 zeros, right? So that means if I divide, I have to move the decimal place that many places. So 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million, 10 million, 100 million. 100 million, right? So, another big point here, right? As I add more zeros in front of the 1, before the 1, the result's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay? 1 over 1 is 1. 1 over 1,000 is 0.001. And then 1 over, how many zeros is here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 9 zeros, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like that. Okay. So good. We've got hopefully some number sense here. Now imagine, let's hang out here for a minute. Imagine if we keep adding zeros before this 1. In other words, imagine if x gets closer to 0. When we divide by that number, what happens to the result? The result gets larger and larger and larger. And so one way that we can sort of say that in a mathematical way is the following. The limit as x approaches 0, and by the way, in this particular example, I'm talking about a tiny positive number. So this number is barely bigger than 0. And on the number line, it is barely to the right of 0. Okay? 0 is in the middle. Barely to the right is going to be this number 0.00001. And then barely to the left is going to be negative 0.00001. Okay? So what I can do is I can specify, am I dividing by a tiny positive number? In which case I'm to the right of 0. And we can see what's happening to that result. That result is getting huge positive. So the result is going to tend toward positive infinity. Likewise, we have the limit as x approaches 0 from the left. And that is what these guys are all about, right? We're getting closer and closer and closer to 0, but from the negative side, yeah? And we see what's happening here. The number gets larger, 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 but with a negative sign. So this, as we continue to add more zeros when we're dividing, is going to give us negative infinity. Okay? And we can also see that if we divide by a large number, we're going to get smaller. So let's graph this thing really quick. So yeah, as we go, 1 over 1 is 1, and then as we go, as x increases, dividing by a large number makes you smaller, and dividing by a tiny number makes your result huge. Okay. So as x approaches 0 from the right, which is what we're doing here as I'm sketching, the y value gets larger and larger toward infinity. And now 1 over negative 1 is negative 1. And again, if I divide by large numbers, the result's going to get smaller, but in the negative direction. And if I divide by tiny numbers, the result's going to get huge, but in the negative direction. And so this little image here really captures division by 0. First of all, notice that at x equals 0, there's no function to speak of at all. Okay? And then if we try to divide by 0, we have to ask, well, am I approaching 0 from the right, or am I approaching 0 from the left? Because if I approach it from the right, I'm going to get a completely different answer than from the left. They're about as different as they can get, as a matter of fact. If I approach from the right, I'm going to positive infinity. If I approach from the left, I'm going to negative infinity. So, no other number is like this. So if I divide by 2, if you take 1 and divide by 2, you're going to get 0.5. If you divide by a number barely bigger than 2, the result will be barely less than 0.5. And if you divide by a number less than 2, the result will be barely bigger than 0.5, right? But if we try to apply that same reasoning to 0, this is what we get. Positive infinity from one direction, negative infinity from another, which is just complete nonsense. Okay? So this is what division by 0 looks like. Particularly these arrows, particularly this part of the function. This part and this part capture what happens when we try to divide by 0. We get completely inconsistent results. Okay. So there we go. That was a fun little video about division by 0. Go ahead and sign off.